Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's talk by art historian John Walsh. I'm sorry that we're starting so late, but we have had enormous response to this lecture series, and we have 120 people in the overflow room right now, so hello to all those people and welcome to them as well. And they have just gotten seated, so that is why we are delayed. It's a good problem to have, I think. Today is the final talk of a three-part series in which John Walsh is discussing the life and work of Vincent van Gogh, told through paintings and drawings of his that live right here in Southern California in the collections of our museums, including the Getty, the Hammer Museum, the Norton Simon, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA. Hopefully these talks will encourage all Angelinos to get out and explore the many myriad wonderful collections here in Los Angeles, and maybe you'll be inspired to go visit some of the other museums around the city. Each of Walsh's talks has focused on one period of Van Gogh's life. Last week's talk focused on his work in Provence, and today's talk will focus on Van Gogh's final years, covering his works made while he was staying in mental hospitals in Saint-Rémy and Auvers. In conjunction with these talks, I'm very pleased to announce that we have a special pop-up exhibition of drawings by Van Gogh on display in our galleries upstairs in the Hammer. This wonderful little exhibition ends at 5 p.m. today, forever. So please be sure to visit the exhibit. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see all of those works together alongside the Hammer's own Van Gogh paintings. Now, before we begin, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones and please avoid taking photos and video. We are video recording today's program, and it will be available on the Hammer website, so you can share it with other people, but it's very distracting for other people in the audience if you bring your camera up, so please don't do that today. Now I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker. John Walsh is the Director Emeritus of the J. Paul Getty Museum, where he served as director from 1983 until 2000. Walsh earned a BA in English from Yale and a master's and PhD degrees in art history from Columbia University. He started his postgraduate degree at the Frick Collection in New York and then moved to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he was a curator in the Department of European Paintings. He left to become a professor of art history at Columbia University and then resumed his curatorial practice as curator of paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. During his 17 years leading the Getty Museum, he oversaw the conception, programming, and construction of the Getty Museum campus in Brentwood and an ambitious program of international exhibitions. He's the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch paintings of the 17th century and of several books, including Jan Steen, The Drawing Lesson, and the J. Paul Getty Museum and its Collections, a museum for the new century. In the field of contemporary art, he has organized exhibitions of artists Sheridan Lord, Ed Ruscha, Leon Kossoff, and Bill Viola. As a freelance art historian and teacher, Walsh was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in 2002, and since 2003, he's been teaching intermittently as visiting professor of the history of art at Yale, as well as training graduate students at the Yale University Art Gallery. And he was president of the Association of Art Museum Directors in 1988 and 1999, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Yale University Art Gallery, and we are proud to say here at the Hammer Museum. In 2003, Walsh gave a series of lectures at Yale called Works of Art and the Work of Architecture. And since then, he's given many more series of short public courses, most of which are now available online. The first was a 12-lecture series on history of painting called Let This Be a Lesson, Heroes, Heroines, and Narrative Painting at Yale. The next was a history of Dutch paintings in 6 pictures. Then came Rembrandt Today, American Views, Viewpoints, and Manipulations, and Vincent van Gogh's Turning Points, and many others. And I encourage you to check them out. You can get an incredible education in art history just from watching these wonderful talks by John Walsh, and they're not only edifying, but also really a pleasure. I want to invite all of you to come after today's talk to join us for coffee, tea, and cookies in the theater lobby, and John Walsh will be there taking questions in lieu of doing a Q&A here at the stage. And just one more last reminder to please silence your cell phones, and please join me in extending a warm welcome to John Walsh.
Thank you, Claudia. the last lecture, we saw Vincent van Gogh at work in Arles, in Provence, where he painted this picture. His career had gotten off to a late start in his native Holland, where he, in his later 20s, started to draw and paint. At the age of 33 in Paris and living with his art dealer brother, Theo, he had a kind of conversion to Impressionism and then rapidly developed a painting style of his own. Barely 2 years later, he left for Arles, where he spent only 15 months, but it was an enormously productive time, and he painted many of the pictures we know best. He had a severe mental breakdown in December 1888 rather, and several more attacks during the next 4 months. Despite being in and out of the hospital, he was lucid during the periods between crises, and he worked hard. Finally, he decided he couldn't look after himself any longer and went voluntarily to a private mental hospital in Saint-Rémy, about a dozen miles away from Arles. He was lonely, but life there was healthier and relatively stable, and he had a fruitful year despite some serious bouts of illness. He was given a room on the upper floor, that's the red arrow with the direction of his view, and another room to use as his studio on the ground floor, facing a large garden, the little green arrow. The sudden isolation was disorienting. He wrote, "I'm like someone who, after having wanted to commit suicide, finds the water too cold and tries to catch hold of the bank again." For the first month, he was not allowed off the grounds, and so he immediately began to work in the garden. He found he hadn't lost any of his skill at drawing. He wrote to his brother, "I have 2 pictures underway, violet irises and a lilac bush. The idea of my duty to work comes back to me often, and I believe that all my faculties will return to me quite quickly." One of those first paintings is this one. It's about 3 feet wide. And I'd like us just to look for a minute, and then I'll make some comments. The image is so familiar that you may not realize that there had never been anything like it. There had been countless paintings of flowers, many of gardens, but none that brought the growing plants so close and cropped out the world outside, as though we were hunkered down or sitting on the ground, up close to the bed of irises. So close that we're looking down on the tops of the plants at the lower right. The composition may look random at first, but it's carefully calculated. Most of the irises are massed on the right side, and all of them are leaning a bit to the left. Now you might feel that this whole thing is a bit out of balance, and it is, because I've tricked you and I've removed that single white iris, but I've just restored it. I put back a couple of other white spots too. The point is that there's a dynamic relationship of visual weight between the single white iris and the mass of blue ones, a kind of game of equilibrium. The colors aren't as brash as those he used at Arles, but we still get vibrant sensations from the strong contrast of colors placed near or next to each other, orange and violet, green and red. Nothing like this had been painted in Europe, but there was another stimulus for Van Gogh, and that was Japanese woodblock prints. At the upper right is Hokusai, whose prints he collected and admired. Irises seen up close. And down below is a kind of painting that the woodcut above it derives from, a kind of folding screen from the century earlier. There were other reasons to paint irises. I think they spoke to Vincent about his own situation, and even about his own personality. They prompted thoughts and emotions that connected to his reasons for being confined there, to stay alive and get well again. In fact, we saw something similar when he painted sunflowers over and over at Arles. Their yellow spoke to him about warmth and vitality. Irises die away, and then they're born again in the spring, regenerated, resurrected. They're not tidy like crocuses and daffodils. They're unruly. Their stems are knobby, with abrupt changes of direction, like your knees and elbows. The blossoms are floppy, and Vincent shows them opening every which way. He called himself once a shaggy dog, and I think disorderliness gave irises an extra appeal for him. Well, the garden seems to have restored him. He wrote, "I have never been so peaceful. I'm able to paint a little at last." Here's the lilac bush that you heard him mention. It's coming into bloom, loaded with blossoms, and taking up almost 2/3 of the picture, leaning over the irises along the path. He's in complete command. He makes decisive brush marks, mostly short staccato stabs and dashes and dabs and hatchings. And here in one amazing picture, he painted the shadowy garden floor with a mass of writhing brush marks. He got the daffled effect of light with strokes of pale blue, yellow, lavender, all still fairly uniform, and he adds a stripe of light at the top to suggest the heat of the day. In the garden, the tall, spindly pine trees captivated him. He accentuated the branches and the clusters of needles that form whorls like flames licking the sky. And months later, he painted a view towards the wing where his studio was. The elongated trees gyrate stiffly to the rhythm of the snaky brushstrokes that he uses for the trees at the right-hand side, and for the undulating limbs, and even for the sky above. Looking at the original here in the Hammer, it's probably struck you as a strange vision. In front of the long yellow facade, people are strolling. And closer to us, a woman with a parasol, and the other side, a man, move towards one another. The trees and the plants seem charged by the same energy, in contrast to the building, which sits stolid on the ground, in contrast also to the red earth. And as if that weren't enough, branches are arching high overhead, making a kind of spooky proscenium. And to include those trees, he creates an impossible field of vision, a kind of wide-angled view, but in the vertical. His painting in the garden has something unsettling about it, and that's true of other views in the garden that followed. Vincent had a debate going with his artist friend, Émile Bernard, about subject matter. Should it be drawn from what the painter has actually seen, or instead should it be imaginary, what they called deux têtes? Historical or biblical? Could those be legitimate modern subjects? Like their influential friend Gauguin, Bernard had reviving Christian subject matter, and he'd painted a Christ in the Garden of Olives. Vincent wrote to Bernard to make the case that it's form and color that should express emotion without a story. And he describes this picture. My combination of red ochre, of green saddened with gray, of black lines that define the outlines gives rise a little to the feeling of anxiety from which some of my companions in misfortune often suffer, and which is called seeing red. And what's more, the motif of the great tree struck by lightning, the sickly green and pink smile of the last flower of autumn, confirms this idea. In order to give an impression of anxiety, you can try to do it without heading straight for the historical Garden of Gethsemane. In order to offer a consoling and gentle subject, it isn't necessary to depict the figures from the Sermon on the Mount. This is an asylum, he says. He wants to convey anxiety, which he knows well. He's had several breakdowns, and others around him have had much worse. The extravagant shapes of the trees and the jarring colors, the whole apparatus of the picture are aimed at stirring anxiety in us. We shouldn't be surprised. Just a year before, he'd painted a cafe at night, and he wrote, "I've tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime." During his first month, he wasn't allowed into the landscape. He wrote, "Through the iron-barred window, I can make out a square field of wheat in an enclosure, a perspective like Van Gogh, which was a Dutch 17th century painter, and above which I see the morning sun rising in all its glory." When his doctor did let him work outside, he set up his easel down in the wheat field after a windstorm, and he painted the long enclosing wall, the far buildings on the far side, and the rising profile of the Alpi, that little mountain range that you saw earlier. What's amazing here is the tilt, how everything slants upward, left to right. Not one thing is level that would help stabilize the composition. He described it matter-of-factly. "In the foreground," he said, "a field of wheat is ruined and hurled to the ground after a storm. The boundary wall, and beyond that the green foliage of some olive trees, some hops and hills, and then at the top of the canvas the great white and gray cloud floating in the azure." The wheat has been whipped up by the wind into waves that heave and crash. And the sky, as you can see, is filled with enormous billowing clouds. This detail, taken in raking light, shows you how completely Vincent has merged drawing and painting. The wheat is a mass of lines drawn with a brush. Up close you can see that there are layers of strokes, warmer, lighter yellows and ochres painted on top of a mass of darker greens and blues. You get a sense of his fervent response to what he's seeing. It recalls an observation by Émile Zola that was often quoted in Van Gogh's time. A work of art is a corner of nature seen through a temperament. What Zola meant by temperament is something like personality, which affects what you choose to paint and the spirit in which you paint it. The work of art, in other words, reveals you as well as your subject. Vincent put his finger on the aspect of his temperament that attracted him to fields of wheat, that they made him complete. He wrote to his mother, "I who have neither wife nor child, I need to see the wheat fields." Van Gogh told his brother that he thought this might serve as a companion piece to the picture he had painted in Arles of his own bedroom. And he says, why? He says, "It's a landscape of extreme simplicity in terms of coloration as well. It would be suitable as a pendant to that study of the bedroom. When the thing depicted is stylistically absolutely in agreement and at one with the manner of depiction, isn't that what creates the quality of a work of art?" So what he's trying to do is suit his style to his subjects. And here the paintings have in common that both were heartfelt responses to subjects of great simplicity. In the one, the wheat fields and the clouds shaped by the wind, and in the other, the calm, ascetic order of the artist's own retreat. As summer came on, he painted more of these views. Here, the rising sun is bigger than life, and not because it actually looked that way, but because it dwarfs everything else in importance. It ripens the wheat. It causes the farmer, and you can see him at the left, causes the farmer to rise with it and harvest the crops. Reaping grain had a kind of primal meaning for Van Gogh. The abundance of the land, the force of the sun, the virtue of labor in the fields. Those things had given his pictures their reason for being, starting in the Netherlands 8 years earlier. His model became Jean-François Millet, as you've heard me say before. A year earlier, he painted these pictures of men sowing seeds, including this one upstairs in the Hammer collection at the top, inspired by Millet's famous picture. He brought prints reproducing Millet compositions to the asylum with him, and he turned again to studying them, making free copies, using the poses of Millet's men, but applying his own color and brushwork. The view of the enclosed wheat field kept drawing him back. Here, it's after the harvest, and his vantage point is lower from the field itself. It's afternoon, and the hot light gives the landscape an almost impressionist brightness. The field has been mowed, except for a fringe. The wheat has been all put up in enormous stacks at the right, and a very Millet-like man in blue comes forward with what must be the last armload of grain. One of the last of these views is taken from his window again, all gray and green. Rain is the element that's what's been missing in this summer campaign of painting the seasons, and now it's here at last to revive the land. The cycle ends in late autumn, with the fields again coming up green. This landscape is strongly organized by the parallel furrows that converge sharply towards the wall and by the sun's concentric rays. Wandering across that rationally laid out ground plane is a ditch, a meandering diagonal that goes its own way and ignores Euclidean geometry. The wall in all these pictures is, of course, about confinement. And here the perspective pulls the eye outside over the wall beyond to where other people are living normal lives. Within walking distance of the asylum, there were olive groves, typical of Provence. And like the pines and cypresses, the trees had a vigor and a personality that appealed to him. Everything in this grove wriggles with life, including the path at the left, and the blue dashes for the shadows and the twisting branches. There are touches of complementary colors too, red and yellow ochre, there to liven up the greens and the blues. Notice that again, his framing crops out the background and concentrates our view. Here, the view is toward the Alpes and towards the most crazily eroded section of these mountains. Now you can see there's an all-over unity in the design. Restless, linear patterns that take in everything, all forms. At the bottom, there's the bumpy terrain that he draws with long, undulating strokes, the snaky green stripe of a road, and then the writhing trunks and branches, and the crowns of the olive trees, each crown echoed by the shapes of the domed hills right behind them. And the cloud undulates too, seeming to float in from a painting by Picasso. This is as much a vision as it is a rendition of a particular place, a vision of some all-pervading force that has been suggested to the artist by nature and then amplified by him. After he painted the picture, he made a drawing of it. Again, he gets the essence of the painting in the drawing, this overall play of restless curling forms that embody his rapturous response. He's gone beyond exaggerating particular elements of landscape, size, proportion, vantage point, to something else, to inventing a comprehensive integration of land and trees and mountains and sky. Below the mountain is an opening in those eroded rocks. A road leads to it past a house that's snug and protected by the trees that surround it. Rising behind it is a fantastically contorted rock wall and bizarre peaks. You have calm, flat, and safe meeting restless, steep, and threatening. A little distance away, the landscape is even wilder. Water has carved a gouged out a gorge, you could say, during an unimaginable span of geological time. And even in the dry season, it still rushes down in and out of the caves and under arches that it created. The ravine is barely passable. You may not spot them right away, but there are two women making their way down, coming over the hump in the rocky path. Now, all this may prompt us to think about the deep time that made the earth both beautiful and perilous for us short-lived humans. Vincent doesn't insist on that prompt or any other. Instead, he embeds them in the image. And he insists that we look at them and think about them by the intensity with which he paints them. Vincent wrote to his brother, "The cypresses still preoccupy me. I'd like to do something with them, like the canvases of the sunflowers. The cypress is beautiful in lines and proportions, like an Egyptian obelisk, and the green has such a distinguished quality. This picture in the Metropolitan has no stabilizing horizontals again, but there is a kind of equilibrium. The yellow field and the gray olives on the left side manage to balance that very tall green dark cypress. Again, with a turbulent sky full of strange cloud forms. I think the picture he announces he wants to do is more like this one, though, where the cypresses stand proudly isolated. Beyond the vigorous grasses in the foreground, the action is in the cypress branches, which don't extend out like the olive trees, but up. It's also in the tight clumps of green foliage that hug the tree as they climb up, creating the obelisk that Vincent describes, the Egyptian symbol of eternal life. All of this against the swirling sky with an impossibly huge crescent moon. Writing about this time in Arles, he said, "When I painted those sunflowers, I looked for the opposite that would nevertheless be equivalent to them. And I said to myself, it's the cypresses." Not as an emblem of Provence, I think he meant that they were as assertive as sunflowers, as strong in form and color, and that they carry messages about vitality in nature and in human life. Now, cypresses are there in Van Gogh's famous Night Piece, playing a supporting role. I'm afraid it's often not so easy to see it, so I'm going to remind you what it looks like with some details and not say much. Van Gogh imagines that we look past a tall cypress down to a village and then up to foothills like the ones that he could see from his window. The town isn't Saint-Rémy, though. It's mostly imaginary. The dark blue sky is full of stars in no identifiable constellations, but they are very large, and each radiates concentric dashes of yellow. And there's an enormous crescent moon. A yellowish stripe of mist lies on the mountains, and above it, in the center of the sky, there's a broad, whirling form that swoops in from the left, dips down, rises up, and doubles back twice on itself. It's not like the Milky Way, which you see on the screen, or any other astral phenomenon that Vincent had seen in real life. He could have heard or read about this great spiral nebula of Andromeda, but his formula doesn't look or behave like it in any case. The clouds in several landscapes do have shapes something like this. I call those visions rather than views, images based on what he saw but distorted. He didn't paint this out of doors, of course. He painted it in his studio from memory and from his imagination. A year earlier, he had written, "Imagination is a capacity that must be developed, and only that enables us to create a more exalting and consoling nature than what a mere glance at reality allows us to perceive." Then he wrote, "A starry sky, it's a thing I'd like to try to do." The picture is a step further than this. We can't know what the vision might have meant to Vincent. The easy way has been to assume that the distortions in the sky were a product of his mental disturbance. We have no idea what hallucinations arose for him during his bouts 6 months earlier, but just as poets like Blake and Joyce use extravagant language, so I think Vincent purposely used distortion to convey his vision of another order, another dimension of existence, beyond language and beyond ordinary pictures. The previous year, he wrote to his brother, "It does me good to do what's difficult. That doesn't stop me from having a tremendous need for, or shall I say the word, for religion. So I go out at night to paint the stars, and I always dream of a painting like that, with a group of lively figures of friends." At the time he wrote that, in Arles, he had a similar but less extravagant vision of the night sky. Here the Big Dipper hangs low over the River Rhone, and its stars are painted with almost childlike rays, and the street lights of the city make long, golden reflections in the water. The picture brings together sky and land, far and near, and possibly divine and human, with a pair of lovers in the foreground as witnesses. He could have seen this painting by Jean-François Millet when he was working for an art dealer's in The Hague and Paris. Millet had written, "If you only knew how beautiful the night sky is, the calm and grandeur of it are so awesome that I actually feel afraid." Millet's nocturne is believable and mystical at the same time, and he includes a detail that Vincent wouldn't have failed to appreciate. Down there at the lower right, 2 tiny reflections of stars in the puddles on the ground. Vast distances seem to collapse, and the stars show themselves on the earth. Starry Night is actually fairly simply composed. The church steeple in the middle is a kind of fulcrum between the visual weight of the cypress on one side and the huge moon on the other. And of course, that steeple has divine aspirations pointing to heaven. Vincent wrote, "Why, I say to myself, should the spots of light in the firmament be less accessible to us than the black spots on the map of France? Just as we take the train to go to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to go to a star." Later in June, when he was working on this picture, he had his first real breakdown at Saint-Rémy, which he said came on me in the fields when I was busy painting on a windy day. I finished the painting in spite of it. Back in the asylum, it's reported that he was trying to eat paint in an attempt to harm himself, or even worse. The attacks lasted 5 weeks. He wrote occasionally saying that his mind was absolutely wandering. What little treatment he got did no good. He remained in his room where he had frightening dreams and bouts of depression. He was finally allowed to go down to his studio in late August or September and begin to work again, making copies after prints that he had brought with him. There was an etching by Rembrandt, too, that shows Christ bringing the dead Lazarus back to life, to the amazement of his sisters and other spectators. Vincent eliminated Christ and zoomed in on the figures of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. He gave Lazarus a red beard like his own. He identifies himself as a man brought back from the dead, but without any reference to divine intervention. Christ is gone, but there's a large yellow sun pulsing in the sky, as if to suggest that it will not be Christ who brings him back to life, but nature. He began to paint portraits again, starting with himself, for lack of a better, for another model, as he told Theo, saying that working on my pictures is almost a necessity for my recovery. He wrote, I began it on the day I got up. I was as thin and pale as a ghost. He showed himself with palette and brushes and smock, ready to resume his true identity, not mental patient, but painter. He seems completely alert, giving himself a shrewd look in the mirror. He's not in pain, not in doubt, but determined. He gave his face a greenish cast, perhaps to emphasize the paleness that you heard him describe. You can see how he paints the hair in 3 passes. There's a beige underlayer, then yellow or yellow ochre strokes, then green, all separate strokes, all put on swiftly, wet paint into wet paint. This picture in the Norton Simon Museum was painted around the same time. A mulberry tree seems to fling out its branches and hot yellow leaves in an exclamation or affirmation of health and energy. The artists as well as the mulberries, all painted with thick strokes and great energy. He resumed painting ordinary people as he had done in Arles, showing them as Provençal types and not as portraits in the conventional sense. This man, simply called the farmer, was a day laborer with colorful clothes and a shrewd southern face who probably worked in the asylum gardens. He's a younger counterpart to the peasant, the portrait of Patience Escalier in the Norton Simon Museum, who was a weather-beaten old cowherd painted a year earlier in Arles to typify the Provençal rural laborer who spends an entire life at hard work in the baking sun and then in the cold Mistral. He made a couple of quick portraits of fellow patients, and he wrote about them, "These unfortunates do absolutely nothing. Like me, they too have heard sounds and strange voices during their crises. Things also appeared to change before their eyes, and that softens the horror that I retained at first of the crises I had, which, when it comes to you unexpectedly, cannot but frighten you beyond measure. Once you know it's part of the illness, you take it in. You take it like other things. I dare to believe that once you're aware of your condition and of possibly being subject to crises, then you can do something about it yourself, so you aren't caught so much unawares by the anguish or the terror. You can do something about it yourself," says Vincent. If we'd asked him what you can do, he'd have said, "You can work." This great self-portrait that he did soon after his crisis that summer was, I think, makes the assertion that neither his imagination nor his skill has diminished. He builds up in his face with parallel strokes, mostly straight and sometimes cross-hatched like a drawing. The expression seems guarded, to judge from his eyes and his mouth, complex, I'd say, and not easily read. Resolute, seems to me. What's so striking is the color scheme, this variations of light blue, and the background, a pattern of restless arabesques that are also there in his jacket, but with a life of their own. They don't radiate from his head, like the emanation of energy in the other self-portrait of this period. They remind you instead of this portrait of his friend, the postal official Roulin, and its looping and scrolling of dahlia stems on the wallpaper at home that sort of domesticates him. I doubt there was fancy wallpaper like this in the asylum. So what was Vincent suggesting about himself? Do these curving and recurving forms express mental complications, forces outside himself? In any case, he generates them with an energy that is firmly under his control. If we turn the portrait 90 degrees, we realize we've seen something similar in the night sky that's invaded by something inexplicable, something insistently looping, propelled by cosmic forces, shaped and guided by the artist's own hand. Not observed, but invented. And I think he'd say not conventional, but modern. This portrait is one of the finest of all. Given the upright dignity, even severity that he projects, we might think this man was a public official, not a kindly orderly in the asylum that he actually was. Van Gogh wrote that he is a man who has seen an enormous number of people die and suffer. And there is an indefinable contemplation in his face. During that spring, he painted a few strange imaginary scenes. On the left is a fantasy with personal meanings. The man in blue with the red hair and beard is evidently Vincent. The woman in yellow with dark hair and an Arlesian topknot gesturing dramatically is quite likely Marie Ginoux, his friend and imaginary lover from Arles, both out for a sunset walk among olive trees under a crescent moon. This is a vision of a kind we haven't yet seen, a projection or a flashback to what might be dream material for Vincent. It occupies the boundary between Vincent's objective observations and his troubled inner life, a fantasy of love that never was. He made the other painting just before he left, evidently as a kind of summation and farewell to Provence. He combined motifs from the region. We recognize them: the tall cypress, a road, field of wheat, and overhead the blue evening sky with a huge moon and a bright star. And now, a year after he encountered a bed of irises in the garden of the asylum, irises have come up again. And he paints another icon of Provence, this familiar pot with an unruly bunch of irises against a wall of warm yellow, a color that Vincent had made his own and, unbeknownst to him, would always be associated with him. Shortly after this, he packed up everything and left Provence for good. And after stopping over with his brother in Paris, he went on to the rural suburb of Auvers-sur-Oise, 20 miles from the city, as the crow flies, an hour by train. Part of its appeal for him was that Cézanne and Pissarro had worked there, following the example of Charles d'Aubigny, a painter of the previous generation that Vincent admired a great deal. Collectors lived there too, including Dr. Paul Gachet, a homeopath with a reputation for treating cases like his. Van Gogh brought along some of his pictures, including one of his self-portraits and a letter from Theo introducing him to Dr. Gachet. He wrote afterward that Gachet was enthusiastic about the pictures, and he said, "Gachet gave me the impression of being rather eccentric, but his experience as a doctor must keep him balanced himself while he's combating the nervous ailment from which it seems to me he's certainly suffering at least as seriously as I am." I really think that I'll stay friends with him, said he, and that I'll do his portrait. He tells me that I must work a great deal, boldly, and not think at all about what I've had, meaning his breakdowns. He was smitten right away by the town and its jumble of irregular buildings and roads and green patches, and the irrepressible overgrownness of it all. A combination of rectangles with great swarms of wriggling serpentine curves, that was certainly suited to his vocabulary. His new friend Gachet was not just a collector, but also an amateur painter and a printmaker. One day at his house, after lunch, he gave Vincent a copper plate and an etching needle and showed him how to use them. The result was this etching, the only print he ever made, that I'm showing you in the example in the Norton Simon Museum, and you can see upstairs. Here's a close-up of the doctor with deep-set eyes and contracted brow, freighted with thought, an expression that strikes us as troubled. Van Gogh presents him more candidly than the stagier images that Gachet presented to the photographer. Soon after that, he painted Gachet's portrait. Now, why don't just look at it for a moment with a couple of details, and again, I'll be quiet and then come back to you. When it was done, he wrote his sister, "What I'm most passionate about, much, much more than all the rest in my profession, is the portrait, the modern portrait. I seek it by way of color. I would like to do portraits which would look like apparitions to people a century later. So I don't try to do us by photographic resemblance, but by our ardent expressions, using our science and modern taste for color as a means of expression and intensification of the character. Thus, the portrait of Dr. Gachet shows you a face with the color of an overheated and sun-scorched brick, with a red head of hair, a white cap in surroundings of landscape, blue background of hills. His suit is ultramarine blue, which brings out the face and makes it paler, despite the fact that it's brick-colored. The hands of an obstetrician, he says, are paler than the face. And before him, on the red garden table, yellow novels and a dark purple foxglove flower. Well, he wants not to be photographic, and he certainly succeeds in that. His modern portrait will put across emotions with what he calls ardent expressions and use color to reinforce them. The blue to set off the face, the vibrations of red and green on the table to agitate the air, the strong yellow books. He's not even mentioning the unease we might feel at the overall wavy outlines of his shoulders and the hills behind and the surface of curved dashes everywhere. He mentions the attributes he's given Gachet, but not what they signify. Each of those two novels is by the Goncourt brothers, and deals with a distinctly modern situation. Mental illness in Germigny Lasserteur, and the complexities of the art world in Paris in Manette Salomon. They identify Gachet's interests, his expertise, his modernity. And the branch of foxglove that he puts on Gachet's table is the source of digitalis, the herbal medicine for melancholia, which was Dr. Gachet's specialty. And Gachet's pose is melancholia itself. Supporting the head in this way is an attribute of melancholia, depression, which since antiquity was believed to result from an imbalance of the bodily humors and was a common affliction of artists. What strikes me is the intimacy here. Gachet gazes directly at the painter who's sitting close to him. Besides identifying his affliction, this pose is unlike any other portrait in its extreme informality. It's a pose you'd give somebody you understood and even sympathized with. He wrote his sister that Dr. Gachet was a true friend, something like another brother. So much do we resemble each other physically and even mentally. And writing to Gauguin, he said he portrayed Gachet with the heartbroken expression of our time, and that it was not destined to be understood, except, I think, by Vincent himself. He writes to his sister, "I'm working a good deal, and quickly these days. You can sense the quickness in this scene in Dr. Gachet's garden, and also in the vase of flowers that he painted with fast, darting strokes." Vincent said, "I seek to express the desperately swift passing of things in modern life." Dr. Gachet had a 21-year-old daughter, Marguerite. Oh, there we are. Vincent showed her at the piano in profile and gives her skirt with a long, thick strokes that curve back up at the bottom, making a sort of elegant, abstract pattern that's soon going to become part of Art Nouveau. She is the picture of calm, withdrawn absorption, unlike the portrait of her troubled father. Vincent went to see Daubigny's widow and set up his easel in the garden next to their villa in the center of town. His ways of patterning trees and shrubs is even more pronounced than it was before. Dashes of green and black that seem to whirl in circles, reminding you, perhaps, of the stars in his night scenes. In the middle of a sea of pea green, he puts lavender shadows around an island of shrubs, and then a childlike lavender cat skulks across on the grass. Flowering trees attracted him, just as they had in Provence, but he treats them differently now. Here the leaves and the blossoms are splashed across the canvas, jittering with an energy that's in the sky, too. It comes from a pattern of hatching that doesn't represent what you actually see, but what he imagined as a kind of visual equivalent to his sensations. Just to say it again, Vincent's great contribution is that, to use the brush not just to depict the world, but also to be an instrument of expression. Earlier that year, before he left Saint-Rémy, he'd seen almond trees in bloom, and he made a similar composition, minus leaves, which hadn't come out yet. He's looking through them to a flawless blue sky and patiently tracing the quirky branches. He owes a lot to Japanese design, as you've been seeing. You can see it here. Side by side, you can sense the change in temperament, expressed by greater haste in the picture at the right. Impatience, perhaps, or different kinds of impulses. Returning to Marguerite Gachet, he copied the picture in a letter he wrote to his brother with a suggestion that it might be hung with a landscape of the same size and shape. Here's that landscape, wider than the widest canvas he'd been using, and something new in its panoramic effect, and breathtaking. You can't easily take it all in. You need to let your eyes move sideways over the scene. It represents the farm fields of Auvers that spread out to the north and beyond the town. Vincent came here often and used other formats to paint it. In this case, nearly square, with pale harvested grain occupying half the picture, then blue sky above, and in between the fields in various stages of growth and harvest. In other words, the ceaseless cycle of life that's such an important part of Vincent's imagery for his entire career. Widescreen framing of a landscape was just as Dutch as Van Gogh himself, and he knew that. It's a tradition he inherited from pictures by Jacob van Ruysdael and from many etchings and engravings, like the famous one on the right by Rembrandt, which all have a grandeur and a kind of sense of comprehensiveness. Vincent painted a dozen more horizontal pictures of the same size, which may well have had a practical purpose. It's actually been proposed that he saw them as decoration in the honorable 19th century sense of being part of the decor of houses, décoration. Horizontal compositions would most often go over doors. Vincent was not too pure to produce this kind of art. He'd written to Theo that nothing would help us to sell our canvases more if they could gain general acceptance as decorations for middle-class houses, the way it used to be in Holland. Well, in Holland, he had a commission, at the top or upper left here, he had a commission for 6 paintings of the season, which came to nothing, except for that scene of plowing and planting, that he didn't even get paid for. And below the Van Gogh is a picture by Daubigny, one of his role models, who used the format for sweeping views. And below that, a completely different subject by a painter everybody admired in that circle, Puvis de Chavannes, who had commissions for this kind of allegorical frieze of figures, which are classical in inspiration, but modern in content. And the Impressionists, like Pissarro at the far right, obliged their clients with décoration for their houses, typically with traditional themes like the 4 seasons. Well, Vincent didn't find a taker for his project in Auvers, but he painted the pictures anyway. At this stage, after his debilitating attacks, you might expect that he'd do disturbed-looking paintings, reflecting inner turmoil. But the opposite seems to be true. If you remember what he was doing exactly a year earlier, you can see this. The view from below his window at Saint-Rémy is a radical composition in every way, surging uphill, all diagonals, no horizontals, turbulent wheat after a storm. It's an image of unease. This one of 6 months later, with life-giving sun rising, is the image of order and stability and renewal. And for the most part, that's the mood of these horizontal landscapes, which are generally subdued and, you could say, reassuring views of places all around Auvers. He may well have intended them as aspects of a kind of utopia, a kind of rural dream of peace and plenty, a celebration of French country life, where the peasantry live harmoniously with the bourgeoisie in a settled but unspoiled place. Van Gogh wrote about Auvers, saying, "It's an almost lush country, just at the moment when a new society is developing in the old, and not at all unpleasing. There is so much well-being in the air." Guidebook writers and the government promoted Auvers as an ideal place. It had all classes of people, from farm workers to wealthy suburbanites. And by the way, that's the chateau of Auvers over in the picture. And it had a productive countryside. As Vincent saw it, the land seems endless, without boundaries, and endlessly changing its face in midsummer. He paints billowing cumulus with the fattest strokes we've seen yet, making loops and knots with them in a kind of shorthand. One of these landscapes is better known than all the rest. I want to slow down again and let you look at it with some care. A field of heavily ripe wheat is bending in unison in the wind. On the left, the road spills into the field, red, with bright green edges, and it turns to split the field in two. At the right, there's another branch. Overhead, the sky is very dark blue, with a couple of clouds and a great flock of crows. There's a fierce clashing of complementary colors, blue against yellow, red against green. Perspective is reversed. Diagonals don't converge here to create the illusion of deep space, but instead they diverge from our vantage point, making the image ambiguous and the mood violent. Ever since this picture has been popularly thought of ever since Irving Stone's novelistic biography of 1934 called Lust for Life, popularly thought of as the last work by Vincent van Gogh. Stone used the image and invented in his book a version of Vincent's death. In the book, the crows are a deadly premonition. The next day, Vincent went out into the fields and shot himself. That was good storytelling. And in the movie version by Vicente Minnelli 22 years later, the story got even better. Kirk Douglas, here playing Vincent, is out painting this picture when the crows attack him. The scene was invented. He most probably painted the picture a couple of weeks before he died, and the crows, which he described as a good omen, left him alone. In 1990, Akira Kurosawa made a wonderful film called Dreams, enactments or reenactments of dreams that he'd had. One of them, called Crows, was of an art student who gets inside Vincent van Gogh's paintings and travels through them and into this one. The man playing the artist was Martin Scorsese. One of these last landscapes shows the town in the rain. Everything is reduced to the simplest, bands of blue and yellows. The town is enveloped by the fields. No particular activity or building, just a single crow. He pictures a condition as much as a place. And he draws again on Japanese compositions like the print at the top that he owned and painted a version of below, and on his experience in the asylum of looking out from the shelter in his upstairs room. But here the view is in the rain from a place there as though the painter and the viewer were both immersed in the landscape, getting pelted, being soaked like the fields that are being restored by the rain. The last picture he painted before his death, he left unfinished. It's the strangest. It's another kind of immersive experience, a close-up of roots clinging to a clay bank. The forms are tangled and hard to read, and our viewpoint is too close for us to make sense of them right away. In last year's movie by Julian Schnabel called At Eternity's Gate, Van Gogh, played by William Dafoe, is correctly shown at work on it shortly before the end. The unruly school children in the background are coming toward him, ready to laugh at his painting, and when they do, he's furious. The bit with the kids is an invention. I might point out that the film, which is very skillful in lots of ways, is the 14th biographical movie about Van Gogh since Lust for Life. 3 weeks earlier, Vincent had spent a day in Paris with his brother Theo and his wife Johanna and their baby. It was a day full of stress, beginning with Theo's own poor health, depression, anxiety over business, and evidently there was quarreling. Friends came to visit, including Toulouse-Lautrec and Albert Aurier at the bottom, who was the first art critic to write wholehearted praise of Vincent's work. A few days later, Vincent wrote Theo and Joe from Auvers, "I still feel very sad. and continue to feel the storm that threatens you weighing on me too. I try to be cheerful generally, but my life is also threatened at the very root, and my steps are also wavering. Despite that, he wrote to his mother and his sister that he was feeling much calmer than last year, as he wrote, and really the restlessness in my head is quite quieted down. He added that he'd painted several large pictures, including vast fields of wheat under troubled skies. He said he was quite absorbed in the immense plain, with wheat fields against the hills, boundless as a sea. I am in a mood of almost too much calm to paint this. He had expected Theo and Joe to come out and visit him in Auvers, but he learned that instead they were going to Holland, and he must have written them an unhappy letter. With it, he enclosed sketches of 4 new paintings. They heard not a word from him for most of a week, which was unusual. 5 days after that, Émile Bernard wrote that on Sunday evening, July 27th, Vincent went into the Auvers countryside, placed his easel against a haystack, and went behind the chateau to shoot himself with a revolver. From the violence of the impact, the bullet had passed below the heart, he fell, but got up 3 times in succession to return to the inn where he lived without saying anything to anybody about his injury. Now, Bernard did not witness any of this, and in fact, there were no eyewitnesses. But I should add that Vincent van Gogh's recent biographers challenged Bernard's report on how Vincent was shot, but their reconstruction has been refuted quite successfully, in my view. I think we can take Bernard's version. Dr. Gachet got a message from Vincent and found him in his room in the inn, where he took care of him with a local doctor who ruled out surgery. Theo was summoned the following day and got there in time to spend some hours with his brother. Gachet made a drawing at the bottom and then the etching above it. Not long after Vincent died, Theo pulled together about 100 paintings and somehow managed to exhibit them in his apartment in Paris as a private memorial, partly aimed at getting critics to look at the work. And it resulted in some warm praise and some puzzlement. As a Dutch critic wrote, Van Gogh takes things to extremes. He sometimes paints blood-red trees, grass-green skies, saffron-yellow faces. Though I had never seen such things, I still understood him. We've come to the end of Vincent's life, and, sadly for him, just barely to the beginning of his fame. That seems to us, looking back, to be a cruel irony and an absurd injustice. But it isn't so surprising if you consider that he spent less than 2 years in Paris, the center of the art world, and he made the vast majority of his important paintings, the ones that made him famous, in his remaining 28 months, living quite far from influential artists and critics and collectors. Well, another series of lectures could be given on the afterlife of his career and reputation, probably not by me. For much of the 20th century, though, his fame rested partly on a myth of his inspired madness. But already, and not long after his death, artists of the next generation, especially Matisse and the so-called fauve painters, were absorbing the influence of Vincent's colors and the inspiration of his expressive and self-expressive brushwork. And these things have had a long life in modern art ever since. In these lectures, we've surveyed Vincent's life work and looked closely at some of his works. Now I have to finish somehow. I've wondered, what would the artist have wanted me to say to you? My guess is that he'd let me remind you of his motives as an artist, the desires, in other words, that propelled him forward. He wrote about them from time to time in his letters. He wanted to use painting to surprise and move his viewers by conveying his own emotions through the act of painting and drawing. From the very beginning of his career, he drew versions of the world that were exaggerated, intensified, compared to the norm for his audience, even the Impressionist norm. These exaggerations carry the strength of his reactions to what he was seeing, and his wonderment and delight triggered his fearless imagination. All right, but to what purpose? At one point he said he wanted to create in painting a more exalting and consoling nature than what a mere glance at reality allows us to perceive. Exalting and consoling. Why an exalting nature? He intended that the amazement and joy that he expressed would come through to us, would pull us beyond our own limits, and to see in the world what we might not have seen. The dance of the olive trees, the stars bigger than life. I think that's the exalting part. And the consoling part, why would we need to be consoled? Well, perhaps, like Vincent himself, we have in some ways failed ourselves or failed other people. We may be aware that we have lost love or lost youth or lost opportunity, lost our capacity for feeling. Vincent knew what he'd lost, and he knew what he had been denied in life. And he knew that he could nevertheless be stirred by what he painted, lifted out of himself, to be consoled. I don't mean distracted, I mean comforted, reassured, consoled. I think he saw that he could console us by showing us his own full absorption in what he painted, his own identification with his subjects, and his fully committed way of rendering them. There can be consolation in new growth on the trees, right before our eyes. Trees that seem to exclude us from the joy in the blooming orchard in the distance. And there can be consolation in painting people, like his companion in depression, Dr. Gachet, whose state of mind Vincent, using what he called a modern taste in color, dared to paint the most poignant things he ever put in words. He dared to paint the heartbroken expression of our time. My dear audience members, I want to end by thanking you for the patient attention that you've given to these long, dense lectures, and I'm very grateful to the Hammer for that, for the little exhibition upstairs, and to you all. Thank you.